Hey guys, welcome back to another JamieBot tutorial. In this video we're going to be talking about Angular fundamentals, and this is for like Angular 2 plus. There are just some fundamental things about Angular which I'd like to cover here so that I don't have to cover it each time I make a new video and annoy everybody who's already heard it a million times. We're going to be covering generating files, and then also talking about components and providers. And with those fundamentals, that's like the basics of what you need to build your own, whether it be an app with Ionic or just a website just with plain Angular, maybe some Angular material. So this video should be helpful for all those scenarios because it just covers those general principles. So let's get into the content. Alright, so first I'm going to generate a project so that we have something to work with. If you haven't seen my video on getting Angular installed, be sure to watch that. But assuming you do have the Angular CLI installed, or the Ionic CLI, one of those two things, I'm just going to generate an Angular project like this, ng new, and then the name of the project, which for me is Angular Fundamentals. I would not like to add routing. I'd like to use SCSS. Okay, so that's all done. Now I'm just going to open up this project in VS Code. Alright, so let's talk about some of the files that this thing generated. At the topmost level, we've just got the package.json, which, if you haven't seen my video on NPM, it's really important to understand how NPM works in case you want to import other packages into your project. Then we've got a README and some other just basic configuration files. We're not going to worry about that. The most important stuff that you got to know about is inside of the source folder, source/app. So most important is this app.module.ts file. So our app just starts out with one module, which by default everything we generate will just be put into that module. So like if I make a new page, it'll just be a part of the module. If I make a new provider for handling data, that'll be a part of the module as well. So in here in the declarations, there's already something declared called app component, and we can see that over here on the left. There's this thing called app component, and this is just a starting place for all Angular apps. So if I serve this app up using ngserve, if I load up the app here at localhost 4200, then I see this home page right here that we have. This is what is contained inside of the app component. So the app component HTML file contains all of that stuff that's just on that page. Welcome to title, welcome to Angular fundamentals, and then so this is our first introduction to what's called a model. So right here it says welcome to, and then there's this syntax with the curly braces. This is the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about in this video. One of the most important things is whenever you see this in the HTML, it's referring to a variable within the TypeScript. And so over here in the TypeScript, we can see within these curly braces right here, there's a class being defined, and this is the class for my component, and it has a variable in it called title. And so that's where this title variable is getting that value from. Angular fundamentals is the string value of title, and then it just pulls it in, and then when we load up the app, it says welcome to Angular fundamentals. So it basically just substitutes that value in there, and then everything else on this page is just hard-coded, or another word for that is just explicitly stated. Like there are no variables here, it's all just text and basic HTML. Okay, so back to what I was talking about earlier, the app component. This entire group of files right here, all of the ones that start with app.component, the HTML, the SCSS, and the TypeScript, these are all part of what declares a component. There's even this .spec file that's for testing. You don't need to worry about that if you're a beginner. Just focus on the TypeScript, the SCSS, and the HTML. And so these files together form what's called the app root component. And app root is just the name of the selector which the creators of Angular gave this class. Like this could be called anything. We could call it like bongo drums or something like that. In fact, I'm going to do that. I'm going to call it bongo drums just because I think I'm funny. And then I'm going to do a global search for app-root so that we can see all the places where that was used. And the main place where it's going to be used is inside of the HTML file. Oh, whoops, let me fix that. There's just a file directly inside of the source folder called index.html. And this is like the actual web page. Everything else is kind of like magically shoved inside of here using Angular. You don't need to worry about how that happens, but just realize that this app-root, this is the name of the component which we would like to put here. App-root is a pretty great name, but I think bongo drums is a pretty good name as well. So we'll just put that in there. So here it is, still working. If we inspect using the developer tools over here, this page, then we can see we have this bongo drums element right at the very top, and then inside of there there's all of our code for that component, all of the HTML, and then the TypeScript is turned into JavaScript actually, and it's just registered in one of these script tags right here. Don't need to worry about that, that kind of happens magically, but it's really important to understand how the HTML gets substituted in here inside of the DOM. That's like all of the HTML right here. So with that knowledge, let's use our own component to see how we might be able to leverage components to build something awesome in Angular. Specifically, components help you reduce code duplication, mostly within HTML, but also just kind of with general functionality. Okay, so let's generate a new component here using ng space g space c. That stands for generate component, and then we're going to do the name of the component, which is going to be called, we'll just call it party. We'll just get our users excited about our app with our party component, and I'm going to put it inside of a folder called components. So that's just how I like to organize it, by providing the folder right beforehand. And then you'll see that over here on the left it generated that component right here. There's our party component. And then if we pop open the TypeScript file, one of the most important things to note about this is that the selector is app-party. So that means if we want to use this component anywhere else in our app, then we need to use this name right here. And so I'm just going to copy that, and then keeping that in mind, I'm just going to quickly show you the HTML. This just says party works for our party component. And then let's say we want to use this inside of our app component HTML, and we'll just put it right after the title. The way that we would do that is we just paste that selector that I just copied, so app-party. So we can basically just treat it like a regular element. We just put the name of the selector, and then Angular will substitute it right here in the app. So I'm going to serve that up once again using ng-serve. Alright, and then back at our app we can see that we have party works right here, and that's looking just awesome. So you can kind of see how that, like if this party component were kind of complicated, we wouldn't want to like duplicate that functionality several times. We would want to put it into a component so that we could reuse it in those multiple places, just so that made our lives a lot easier. Okay, now within the party component HTML, I am going to do something that makes this party component a little bit more special, just so that we can understand like the value of not having to duplicate the functionality. So I'm going to make a variable in the party component TypeScript file, and we'll just call this one countdown or something like that, and this is just going to be an array of numbers, which is like 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And then inside of the HTML I'm going to use something called ng4 to repeat those numbers. So I'm going to say ng4. Okay, and basically the syntax right here is just saying repeat this element for every number in countdown. So the countdown is an array, and so for every single number in that array it's going to repeat this element one after the other. And then over here, oops, I put number instead of num. Over here we just put the variable which we like to represent each number inside the array. And so the result will be we'll have 5 divs, each with a number inside of it, counting down. So let's check that out. There we go, there's our 5 divs. So hopefully that makes sense. We're just using the ng4 to repeat the numbers in the countdown. And then if we want to like repeat the party element as well, we can simply duplicate that, and then we don't have to rewrite any functionality. It's all just packaged inside of this app party element. And then now back on the page we see we have it twice, so a lot of functionality for very little work. So you can see how if you had a website with lots of similar things being used all over the place, then using components could really reduce the amount of code you had and like make maintenance easier, because if you make changes then you only have to change it once as opposed to having to change it multiple times. Alright, so we just finished learning about components. It's basically just like a piece of the page which you can declare if you want to use it more than once, so you don't have to rewrite anything. And now we're going to talk about providers. So a provider is basically a way of reducing duplicate code in a like TypeScript file, so like the logic of the application, or data. So like if you have a value that you need to be used all over your app, then it's probably a good idea to put that value inside of a provider so that all the different parts of your app can access it without you having to like redefine it all over the place. And that way if you change it, you only have to change it once. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's say that we have like a special date for this party app we're making, and we need the date all over our app. Well, instead of putting the date everywhere, I'm going to generate a new provider using this command right here. And by the way, service and provider are synonyms. In Angular they mean the same thing. So ng space g space service, so service is a provider, and then this is the location of where I want the provider to go. I like to put it in a folder called providers, and then another folder in there for the provider name, and then finally the name of the actual provider, which is info. So if I do that, it'll just simply make a folder over here called providers, and then inside of there it's organized exactly like the components is. We've got a folder called info, and then we have our provider right here. So inside of the file it generated, up here it says it's injectable, and this is what makes it a provider, is because it can be injected or placed into other TypeScript files. I'll show you what I mean in a second, but I just want you to realize the difference between this provider, which is injectable, and then the component, which has this component marker up here with this @ symbol. So this is a component, and this is a provider right here. And then inside of the module file, I just need to add it to the providers array down here. So sometimes it adds it there for you, but if it didn't, just make sure it's added to the providers array. Do not put it in the declarations, only in the provider array. Up here this is for like components and things of that nature, but this is specifically for providers. Inside of our provider, at the top, I'm just going to make a variable here. We're going to call it party date, and it's basically just going to be a string describing when the party is. We'll say that it's just today, which is March 5th, 2019. And then let's say that our two components, the app component and the party component, they both need access to this variable. Well, inside of the TypeScript file, what I can do is inject that provider, and this is just the syntax for injecting it into this component. Or another way of saying that is, this is how I give this component access to that service. So as long as this variable is public, it can either be private or public right here. If it's public, it can be directly used inside of the HTML. So inside the HTML, I'm going to put an h1 at probably the top of it, which just accesses that variable. So remember, this syntax is used to access variables, and if a dependency is public right here, then that means you'll be able to access it in the HTML as well. If it's private, you won't be able to do that. For this one up here, it doesn't matter, it just defaults to public, but this one you always just specify private or public, and if it's public then you can access it over here. So the name of the variable is called info provider, and then we're going to say dot, and then the name of our variable was party date. So we'll just copy that, so it's dot party date, and that will simply display the party date at the top of the party component. Okay, and then back in our app we see that it is showing the date inside the party element, so our party element was able to get access to that text. And let's say that we wanted to access this inside of the app component as well. Well, we'll just pop that open and then declare a constructor and inject the dependency the same way, and auto import that from the providers folder. And then maybe at the bottom here, at the very bottom of the page, we'll just put a paragraph tag with the party date as well. So it'll be styled differently, so that same information can be styled differently. That's one of the benefits of having a provider versus a component. And by the way, this is kind of like a silly example. There it is, by the way, at the bottom, March 5th. It's kind of a silly example because there's like such a small amount of information, but the theory still holds true. If the information needs to be duplicated a lot of times, then it's smart to put it inside of a provider, just in case you ever change that information. The only place you need to change the information, if you do it this way, is going to be right here. You just make one change. So I'll change this to March 6th, I move my party date, and then boom, all references to the party date change to March 6th. So hopefully that's enlightening. It's certainly a very powerful technique. You can code a lot faster if you code this way, where you try and eliminate duplicate code. You can go overboard, of course, but in general it's usually best to just avoid duplicate code. So we've looked at components and providers. So a component is a part of a page, and a provider is like a provider of data or some sort of functionality. And now we're going to look at using other modules inside of our module to make it better. Like let's say that we want to make an HTTP request to get some data from a server. Let's check out how we can do that. So let's import the HTTP client from Angular Common HTTP. Make sure that it's coming from here, not from Selenium. Sometimes auto import will import it from the wrong place. So this module is from Angular. That's what this @Angular is for, and it's just used to make HTTP requests. So let's say that inside our app component we want to just make a GET request and get some data and show it on the page. So here we can inject the HTTP client, not the module this time, just the client. And it's important to note that this HTTP client, this is a provider, and the provider lives inside of the module. So since we imported the module, we get access to all of its providers, just the same way that our module has its own provider. This one, the info service, the HTTP client module has its own provider in it, which is called HTTP client. And so we just inject that right here so that we can use it, and we're going to use it to make a GET request. So this is the format for that HTTP request. We call it http.get. Then we pass it the name of the route which we'd like to go to. And I found this test URL online, so we're going to use that to test our GET request. And then when we get the value back, once the promise has completed, we're just going to say console.log that value so that we can inspect it and make sure that it's working. So back on our page we can see we have all this data returned, so looks like it is working. And then let's just say that on our page we want to show the accept header or something like that. I'm just going to make a variable up here called accept header, and then when we get the response back, I'm going to assign the header to be val.headers.acceptHeader, which is just where that data is located. And in order for that to work, I need to declare val of any type, just so that it'll actually work. And then inside of the HTML file, at the very top here, I'm going to put another h1, and it's just going to say display me the variable accept header. And it looks like nothing's up there. I think I named the variable wrong. Oh, it's called just accept. So instead of saying .accept header, I'm just going to say .accept, and it's capital like that. So we'll save that. And there we go. At the top we have the data from the request. So the request itself accepts JSON and plain text. If that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry about it. I'm just showing you how we can import a provider from a different module into our code. So that is how we do it, something like that. You can really move a lot faster in your project if you know how to import modules like this and then use code that's already pre-built, already works. Alright guys, that's all I have for this video. Leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.